Hi, everyone. Given the recent geopolitical events, I thought it would be timely to discuss why we're witnessing the death of the sovereign order. I've prepared a talk on power, constraint, and what is quietly changing. Let me be clear at the outset. This is not a talk about personalities. It is not a talk about Venezuela, and it is not moral judgment of individual regimes. It is a structural argument. Something fundamental is changing in the international system, and most commentary is failing to describe it accurately. Governments are being removed without invasion. States are being economically neutralized without declarations of war. Assets are frozen. Access is revoked. Legitimacy is withdrawn, often without adjudication, and almost always without reciprocity. These are not speculative trends or future risks. They are present facts. What distinguishes this moment is not disorder, it is method. Power today is exercised less through force than through access, access to markets, to financial systems, to institutional legitimacy itself. Participation is conditional, compliance is assumed, penalties are imposed administratively. And all of this occurs while the language of order, law, and democracy remains intact. That contradiction is what I want to examine. Not the headlines, not the personalities, the structure. To understand what is changing, we have to first remember why sovereignty existed in the first place. The modern idea of sovereignty did not emerge from philosophical optimism, it emerged from exhaustion. After the first half of the 20th century, after the industrialized war, mass displacement, and the near total breakdown of restraint, the architects of the post war order reached a hard conclusion. Unconstrained power destroys the conditions that make order possible. Sovereignty was not designed as a moral endorsement of states. It was designed as a mechanical restraint on force. Borders were not treated as sacred because they were just. They were treated as inviolatable because violating them had too easily proven catastrophic. Non-intervention was not indifference, it was recognition that allowing powerful states to decide when interference was justified would collapse into domination. In other words, sovereignty was never about trusting rulers. It was about distrusting power. For decades, the system functioned not because rules were never broken, but because they were treated as binding in principle, even by those strong enough to ignore them. That principle is what is now eroding. There's an important historical fact that is often omitted in contemporary discussion. When the post-war sovereign order was constructed, much of today's global reality did not yet exist. India was not yet a sovereign state. China, while formally present, bore little resemblance to the economic, industrial, and technological power that it is today. The distribution of population, production, and influence that now defines the global system was not reflected in the architecture of the order itself. This asymmetry was acknowledged at the time. It was tolerated on the assumption that the system would restrain excess, that sovereignty would act as a buffer while participation broadened and power diffused. For a surprisingly long time, that assumption held. What is striking today is not that India and China have grown into central actors. That was inevitable. What is striking is how they now speak about sovereignty. Despite their exclusion from authorship, they tend to invoke sovereignty as a fixed principle. Non-interference, territorial integrity, and formal equality remain central to their external posture. If the story were simply about rising powers rejecting inherited constraints, we would expect the erosion of sovereignty to originate there. However, it has not. The most significant pressure on sovereignty today is coming from the architects of the order itself, above all, the United States. The state that insisted most forcefully on sovereign equality, non-intervention, and rule-based legitimacy now treats those principles as contingent. This shift is not announced as abandonment, it is framed as exception. as necessity, as realism. Rules are not denied, they are reinterpreted. Sovereignty is not rejected, it is conditioned. Law is not discarded, it is bypassed. The system retains the language of legitimacy while quietly abandoning the discipline that once gave that language meaning. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. Hypocrisy assumes awareness of contradiction. What is unfolding here is closer to sophistry, the substitution of rhetorical continuity for structural consistency. Power begins to explain its freedom as necessity. At this point, the discussion can no longer remain purely empirical. When the language of order persists while the constraints erode, technical analysis becomes insufficient. The system begins to contradict itself, and the contradiction is the traditional domain of political science, of political philosophy. This is why thinkers, long treated as historical curiosities, re-enter the conversation, not as ornaments, not as metaphors, but as diagnosticians. Political philosophy exists precisely for moments like this, moments when institutions continue to function, but legitimacy quietly detaches from structure. It is not concerned with policy outcomes. It is concerned with the conditions under which power becomes self-deceiving. That is why Plato matters now. Plato's story of the Ring of Gyges is often misunderstood. It is not a thought experiment about personal morality. It is a structural diagnosis of power. Gyges acquires a ring that grants invisibility. Freed from observation, he can act without consequence. Plato's question was not whether Gyges is evil, but whether anyone would remain just once accountability disappears. The answer is unsettlingly clear. Justice does not collapse because individuals are uniquely corrupt. It collapses because constraint vanishes. Plato's insight was political, not psychological. Justice in a society is not sustained by virtue alone. It is sustained by limits, by the knowledge that power is answerable to something beyond itself. The modern ring is not invisibility, it is impunity. When enforcement becomes discretionary, adjudication is bypassed, and consequences apply asymmetrically, power occupies the position of Gyges, not because it seeks injustice, but because the system no longer requires restraint. At that point, injustice no longer needs to be enforced. It is administered. Markets do not read philosophy. They respond to constraint. As sovereignty becomes conditional rather than absolute, markets quietly reprice exposure. What is being repriced is revocability. The risk that access, legitimacy, and enforceability can be withdrawn through discretionary decision rather than neutral process. That risk is migrating upward into the core of the international system. We should expect to see increasing capital deployed to price, hedge, and manage revocability, particularly in sovereign technology stacks. That is not ideological behavior, it is mechanical. Where political philosophy names the failure, markets confirm it. This is not primarily a military crisis, it is an epistemic one. Force can rebalance power, it cannot restore legitimacy. The sovereign order is not dying because it was attacked, it is dying because it was forgotten by those convinced they no longer needed limits. The question is not whether the world is changing, it is whether we still understand what the change demands of us.